Thank you all for hanging with me. This is a lot. I want to do a very quick review of what we just covered with the simple diagram. So again, faculties of the human person. St. Thomas stratifies them more or less in this order with the intellect and will at top. Those are the highest faculties because they're the ones reserved to the immaterial soul, which is where we can most directly reflect the image and likeness of God. So all these other lower faculties are at least partly material. They have a flesh component residing in our physical body and are directly affected by what happens in the body. And then St. Thomas also described this thing called the cogitative power, which essentially packages up all the lower faculty data to create a phantasm, which is a unified, emotionally loaded concept that gets delivered to the intellect. And as it does this, the cogitative power has some autonomy and it gets to make some decisions. But it does this at a level akin to a project manager for a company versus the CEO, which would be the intellect. Junior brain versus the real thing. Both the cogitative power and the intellect can grasp or apprehend. They can understand at some level. Both of them make comparisons. Is this like this other thing I've seen before? Is it different? They both make judgments in a way, but only the intellect has the full use of reason, which is why it's on top. The key to using this in therapy is that if you understand all this, you can use your intellect to influence your cogitative power so that it serves your purposes instead of you serving it. The flesh serving the soul so that things stay in right order instead of the other way around. So now, with that, I want to zoom way out, and I want to look at some of the differences between a Catholic approach to mental health, which we've just been talking about in great detail, and some typical modern secular approaches that many of us are familiar with. Starting with some basic definitions. What is mental health? What is mental illness? Well, according to the American Psychological Association, mental health is defined as a state of mind characterized by emotional well-being, good behavioral adjustment, relative freedom from anxiety and disabling symptoms, and a capacity to establish constructive relationships and cope with the ordinary demands and stresses of life. So that sounds okay, right? I mean, there's nothing you're really going to disagree with. The APA doesn't have a specific definition for mental illness. They prefer the term mental disorder, and they define that as any condition characterized by cognitive and emotional disturbances, abnormal behaviors, impaired functioning, or any combination of these. Such disorders cannot be accounted for solely by environmental circumstances, may involve psychological, genetic, chemical, social, other factors. Again, I'm not going to disagree with their statement exactly. It's basically true as written. But if you look closely at both of these definitions, you will notice something. Look at the language itself. Mental health is defined as a state of mind characterized by some things. Mental disorder is described as any condition characterized by some things. So for both definitions, there's no actual definition happening. They're characterizing. They're both saying it's a thing and it kind of looks like this, this, and this. And so by consequence, these definitions can be very, very broad and essentially permit these labels of mental health and mental disorder to be applied wherever and whenever we want. Mental disorder becomes potentially any situation where there is subjective distress or abnormal behavior that's distressing to someone else. But what is normal behavior and who's defining it? That's going to depend entirely on the prevailing culture. So it depends on who's in charge. I just want to point out the lack of precision, that there's a great deal of subjectivity inherent in how we define these things in our modern culture. Now, as you might expect, St. Thomas is a little more specific than that. According to St. Thomas, mental health per se is that quality of the possible intellect by which it acts according to its own nature. So let me translate that. Mental health is when your intellect functions as it was intended, as it was designed. And how is that? Well, we can refer to the manual. Recall that according to St. Thomas, the intellect does 3 things. It has the power to apprehend, to know and understand the truth. It has the power to reason, and it has the power to judge. And so with that, it becomes pretty straightforward to define mental illness because, most simply put, illness is a negation of health. Health is when you're well, illness is when you're not. Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to review these. Again, cogitative power, 3 things, intellect, 3 things. That's what it is. So health is when the intellect does what it's supposed to do. And illness is when it's not. Mental illness per se is a defect or defects in the possible intellect which makes it incapable of rational judgment or reasoning properly. One acts contrary to rational principles as a result. So in other words, mental illness is what happens when, because the intellect is unable to reason and or judge as it should, this then manifests in irrational behavior. Because the intellect should be rational as it informs the will, thought gets translated into word and deed. If the intellect is irrational, the behavior is also irrational. And notice that the focus in these Thomistic definitions is on the highest faculties, on the intellect and the subsequent behavior. Emotional distress is not mentioned. Whereas modern definitions elevate the emotions to the same level as the intellect and will. So in addition to the understanding of what the cogitative power is and how it works, this is at the core of the difference between Thomistic psychology and everything else. Modernly, it all comes down to emotion and the place that you give it. It's not that emotion isn't important. Emotion is extremely important. But is emotion something that you trust to lead you on its own? Do we include it as a guiding faculty on par with our intellect? Or is emotion something that we recognize is not fully rational? Isn't that obvious that emotion isn't rational? You know, unfortunately, no. Today, it's not obvious that that's the case. So another thing, in Thomistic psychology, there is a line that we can and should draw right here between the higher faculties and everything below that. There's real significance to this line in addition to delineating the realm of the cogitative power, again, that project manager for the lower faculties, because according to Father Ripperger and other exorcists, this line indicates the boundary beyond which spirits other than God cannot pass. In other words, demons have access to everything below this line. Demons can stir our emotions directly as well as indirectly by affecting our memory and our imagination. Demons can pull images out of our memory and stick them into our imagination in order to manipulate us, to tempt us, to frighten us, to divide us from God and from other people, as well as to derail us from practicing virtue. This is one reason it is so crucially important to guard ourselves, but especially our children, against pornography. Because once an image is in there, it can be used against you. You can't unsee things. You can pray for the grace to forget them, but it's a lot easier just to avoid them in the first place. So this concept of our vulnerability to the enemy in these areas should be a sobering thought, but it shouldn't scare us too much, because the other thing to know or to remember is that the higher faculties can and should be in charge. The stronger our higher faculties are, the more well-ordered these things are, the more resistant to temptation or any form of demonic interference we will be. Because demons do not, under any circumstances, have direct access to our highest faculties. Nothing can take away our free will. Now, the free use of our will can be heavily constrained by really strong out-of-control emotions, as we've been talking about. But even in that case, it still remains free, and God himself can and does assist us with his grace, because God has access up there. Demons don't. So, leaving the spiritual realm aside, largely, for a moment, I want to comment here about how we can understand the detrimental effect of social media based on this diagram. I think it's obvious to all of us that social media, for all its usefulness and potential benefit, has done some harm, especially for young people. Well, here's why. Because social media trades on the memory-emotion interface. It kindles and accelerates fires that burn down there in the lower faculties. So when we're scrolling and clicking and filling our brains with images and people's comments and likes and dislikes and drama and all the rest of it, we are just marinating down here in a stew of the lower faculties. So every post on Facebook, every photo on Instagram goes into our imagination, where our cogitative power is comparing it to everything else we know. And this leads to us constantly comparing ourselves to everybody else. And as we do this, our focus is not generally on anything virtuous or helpful. It's on us, and not in a good way. And it all happens so fast and with so much urgency that our project manager, our cogitative power, kind of forgets his place. If he does allow any input from the CEO, he doesn't allow any time for any of this information to get processed by the higher faculties. It's click, 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 like, subscribe, comment, with no higher faculty reasoning going on. So these lower faculties get stronger and stronger, and the emotions get louder and louder, and our higher faculties get more and more removed from the action, which weakens their ability to exert any control. I see nodding. This makes sense to everybody. There's a book by Jonathan Haidt that came out recently about the effect that smartphones and social media have on a whole generation. These kids who have never not known life with these things. I have not read this, but I would like to. I think it's very worth checking out. So that's all kind of depressing. What I'd like to do now is to shift into more hopeful territory, more positive things, and talk about some things that modern psychology really gets right. There are some therapies out there that get a lot of things right, actually, and actually do help people. So I want to show that we can understand how and why they help people through the lens of Thomistic psychology, as well as where we might potentially tweak or make additions to make them even more beneficial. The therapy that everybody tends to think about first when they hear about Thomistic psychology, the one that most obviously shares a great deal in common with St. Thomas, is cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT. And you know something is mainstream when they make a For Dummies book about it, right? So sure enough, this is a very well-known, very widely practiced set of therapy tools that is overwhelmingly considered the first-line treatment for just about anything you can think of. Certainly anxiety and depression, but also pain management, insomnia, addictions, eating disorders, psychotic disorders, I mean, you name it. And there's a ton of research that backs this up. There are many randomized controlled studies, and insurance companies are usually more than happy to pay for CBT, especially because CBT is often done in a time-limited way. It's like a package of 6 or 8 or 10 sessions. It doesn't go on forever and ever, laying on someone's couch every week. So it tends to be very cost-effective. In truth, CBT is actually not just one thing. It's a collection of things. And there's kind of 2 streams of therapy that converged, one being C for cognitive and the thinking part, and the other things being focusing on behavior, B. So there are people who still practice as primarily one or the other. They call themselves cognitive therapists or they call themselves behavioral therapists. But generally, most people these days kind of sit somewhere in between and combine concepts from both sides. And as I've said, these therapies share a great deal in common with St. Thomas. There's a very, very well done article. It is elegant, but it is very dense, by Giuseppe Butera from 2010 that was published by Johns Hopkins, if you can believe it, entitled Thomas Aquinas and Cognitive Therapy, an exploration of the promise of Thomistic psychology. And to quote from him, although Thomas Aquinas never developed an account of the emotional disorders, he anticipated all the major principles and methods of cognitive therapy in his philosophical psychology. So Dr. Butera goes on to compare point by point, it's a long article, Thomistic psychology with the writings of Aaron Beck, who is referred to as the father of cognitive therapy. And these line up in a remarkable way. I mean, it would take hours to go through this all, but it is excellent and really worth a read if you're interested. Since we have limited time today, I'll just hit some highlights. So at the heart of cognitive therapy is the idea that behind every emotion is a thought. In the words of Aaron Beck himself, there's a conscious thought between an external event and a particular emotional response. So in other words, it's not the event in and of itself that causes, let's say, depression, say getting fired from a job. If you become depressed after getting fired, it's because there's a thought that occurs in response to the event of getting fired. You might think, well, I'm a failure, I can't do anything right, of course they fired me. Or I'm too old to find another job, I'm gonna lose my house, it's over, I'm ruined. Those thoughts are what lead to depression. It's not the event itself. There are actually some circumstances where getting fired might be a source of relief. And if that's the case, you're not gonna be depressed by it. So thoughts cause depression, not events. This idea does offer some hope for people to feel better through therapy, because even if we may not always be able to control the events in our lives, we can at least take some control over our thoughts. Well, Aaron Beck points out that our thoughts come about because of a judgment that's being made, and that these judgments are occurring very much in the background of our awareness. We're not really paying attention to the fact that we're making them. He calls them automatic thoughts. Again, if loss of a job equals I feel depressed, it's because in between there's a judgment. For example, that being fired equals I'm a worthless failure, or that you have no ability to get another job. So as I hope you can see, cognitive therapy does sound awfully Thomistic. And St. Thomas would largely agree that emotions arise from judgments that are being made, although he would explain this in terms of the cogitative power, which doesn't really exist per se in Aaron Beck's understanding of human psychology. According to Dr. Butera, the main problem St. Thomas would have with Aaron Beck's strictly cognitive therapy is simply that it isn't cognitive behavioral therapy. The B makes a difference. As I said before, you'll find people who consider themselves one or the other, cognitive or behavioral therapists. Those people might agree that both approaches have merit, but they might disagree about which one should be primary. Do you need to concentrate on correcting automatic thoughts first, as Dr. Beck would say, or are behavioral therapists right when they assert that it's more important to correct the behaviors first? We should do that first, let the thoughts, take care of the thoughts later, because what people do is the external face of mental illness anyway, right? That's what causes all the problems. So who's right? Well, to paraphrase from Dr. Butera, Thomas Aquinas would say they both have a point, that you need to go at it from both angles. Because changing your actions alone isn't going to cure a mental disorder any more than just talking about your automatic thoughts makes them go away. Let me say that another way. Changing a behavior in isolation does not restore mental health. It doesn't heal the intellect, because remember, that's the definition of mental health. And it's very hard just to talk yourself out of deeply rooted but incorrect beliefs. It actually assists in that process if you change some of the behaviors as you're trying to do it. Most therapists actually know this from experience, and so do most people in general. But and modern CBT acknowledges it, but it can't explain why this is so. Dr. Butera explains it all by going into the details of Thomistic psychology and talking about the function of the cogitative power and why it's necessary to change both thought and behavior to really get at the heart of the problem. Interestingly, he points out that the cogitative power is non-rational rather than irrational. That's an important distinction, because we said the cogitative power doesn't have the full use of reason like the intellect, but it's not that it's necessarily irrational, it simply doesn't reason. So he uses a great illustration to explain this, which anyone who's ever owned a dog will understand. So Butera likens the cogitative power to a dog who forms the habit of sleeping in its master's bed. Once that habit's been formed, it's hard to break. The dog has the ability to obey an order to sleep elsewhere, but that original habit will reassert itself unless the dog is made to sleep in its own bed on many successive nights. You can't just redirect the dog once. You're going to have to do it again and again. Likewise, the cogitative power forms habits of thought and response, and the old habits will continue to reassert themselves over and over unless the intellect can enlighten it and apply reason, not just once, but again and again, reminding it of and reorienting it to that new information that changes the whole picture. Remember my patient Paul with the toaster. Paul was going to have to keep having those insecure thoughts and emotions from time to time, along with the urge to hide from his friend, especially that friend. He was going to have to commit to reasoning, using his intellect again and again, going through the whole scenario. And in fact, we did that at a session this past week, to repeatedly remind his cogitative power of the truth that his intellect had arrived at, the sound of the toaster and what that meant, so that he could settle down those emotions and free himself to act in a mature, rational way. He'll eventually form that new habit, so he wouldn't have to think about it so much. But it's a process. It's not enough to tell the dog once. You have to keep doing it. And you have to make him get off the bed even though he doesn't want to. Repeated thought and repeated action. Over time, the emotions will come around, but it takes time and discipline. So in summary, CBT is pretty good, especially if you have both the C and the B together. It works, but it doesn't understand why it works. The place where CBT and Thomism will ultimately part ways is going to be around what to do with really deep suffering, because you can only change your thoughts about that so much. Sometimes really bad things happen, and suffering is truly unavoidable. So then you have to come up with a way to believe there's a reason, believe there's some meaning and purpose in it. And a secular understanding of the meaning and purpose of suffering, such as that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that'll only get you so far. But a Catholic understanding of the reparative value of suffering, the idea that we can unite our suffering to our Lord's sacrifice on Calvary for the salvation of souls as well as the reconciliation of our own soul with its Creator, which leads us to deeper union with God. This is the ultimate sound of the toaster that can enable us to bear anything with Him, because He helps. He helps us in this. St. Thomas understands and believes this, whereas Aaron Beck does not. So I need to mention a therapy that arose from CBT that gets even closer to Thomism, something called ACT. ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, and here again we have a dummy's guide. At least one of the co-developers of this therapy, Stephen Hayes, who wrote the foreword to this book, was raised Catholic, as I understand it. So that would explain the presence of some very Thomistic principles. In ACT, the inevitability of suffering is acknowledged and its value is emphasized. ACT trainers and therapists will say things like, suffering is the price of admission to a meaningful life. And where you find your pain, you find your treasure. In ACT, the behavioral component is key. You have to acknowledge and deal with your emotions, but you can't let them dictate how you behave. In ACT, clients are encouraged to make use of their values, including spiritual beliefs, to heal and to grow. So overall, it is really about as Thomistic as you can get without explicitly including God, but in ACT, you don't have to explicitly exclude Him. So this is good stuff. I want to quickly mention DBT, again, the Dummies book, standing for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. And this is the type of therapy that was used in that Australian study that I mentioned at the beginning of the last talk, which when they applied it broadly in an Australian study, they made some people worse rather than better. Now, DBT basically came from CBT and shares a lot with ACT. DBT definitely acknowledges that suffering is unavoidable, and it offers some very powerful tools to manage it. The intent here is very good. It can and does help people who struggle with overwhelming emotions. It equips them to learn to control their behavior in a way that can really change lives. In the case of the Australian study, I think the problem was that they were applying it too broadly. I mean, yes, teenagers as a rule have strong emotions, but some kids have better ordered faculties than others. If you treat everybody the same, if you make too many assumptions about what the person needs instead of finding out where they're at and working with the strengths and values they already have, it is possible you're going to do more damage than good and actually teach some bad emotional habits to kids who already had good ones. This is a point Abigail Schreier makes in her book that I mentioned earlier called Bad Therapy. But I wouldn't necessarily paint the therapy itself as bad as much as the tone-deaf implementation of it. I want to talk about one more modern therapy that gets a lot right and contains some very Thomistic elements. This one is called IFS, or Internal Family Systems. There's no dummies guide here. But it is pretty mainstream. IFS, as originally conceived, has more in common actually with Eastern religions than with Christianity. Nevertheless, the basics of this therapy are not overtly spiritual, and they have turned out to be an incredibly useful type of therapy that is very compatible with our Christian faith. So if my hypothesis is correct, there must be something truly Thomistic in here, right? So IFS considers us all naturally to have what they call parts. And we use this language just commonly, talking about, well, part of me feels this way, part of me wants this. In IFS, the idea is that we all have kind of inner child identities of various ages that are, each one is rooted in foundational experiences we've had and the memories that were formed from those. So how many of you have had the experience of, as a mature adult, getting together with your family a family of origin over the holidays, and suddenly you and your brother are sitting on the couch fighting over the remote like 6-year-olds. There's something will happen to us that can be so reminiscent of a situation that we dealt with in childhood. Sometimes it's very literally reminiscent, like sitting next to your brother in your parents' living room, arguing about what's on TV, that it's like it takes us back in time. This happens in a very dramatic way in full-blown PTSD. This is where a reminder of someone's past trauma will trigger them. And when that happens, you might have an elderly Vietnam vet who suddenly starts acting like they're back in the jungle running from Charlie and dives under the bed screaming. In a much less dramatic but a still significant way, this can happen to all of us in our daily lives, even when we're not visiting family. So IFS would explain it like this. Say you're 8 years old and your sandwich dripped jelly on your shirt at school and everyone made fun of you for the rest of the day. And ever since then, you've had anxiety when you're eating in public. So this part of you, this 8-year-old part, is fearful of being judged or ridiculed by others. It expects to be made fun of because that's what happened. So anytime you're eating in public, this part is liable to wake up and kind of think, wait, I've been here before. And then it can sort of take over your brain so that you respond to what's going on in the present moment more out of this 8-year-old part of yourself instead of as a mature adult. We all do this at times, sometimes, or some people more so than others. So according to IFS, we all have parts, lots of parts. IFS goes on to describe roles that some of these parts have. There may be some very shameful, painful parts that we don't want to acknowledge and we try to pretend aren't there. We keep them very carefully hidden, and those would be called exiles. There are other parts that develop as we try to compensate for those exiled, shameful parts. We might try to conquer whatever issue they faced or protect them or keep them hidden. So those are called manager parts or firefighter parts. And then the idea is that the internal system of all these parts interacts with each other in some ways like a family, hence internal family systems. Now there are some well-known, very good Catholic psychotherapists, psychologists, particularly Dr. Peter Malinowski and Dr. Jerry Crete, who put a lot of stock in this type of therapy. Both of them strive to practice a very Catholic-friendly version of it, which they use to very good effect. Dr. Crete prefers to use the term parts work to distinguish what he does from the original IFS. And he wrote a book recently that came out at the beginning of the year called Litanies of the Heart. And he's been a guest on Matt Fradd's Pints with Aquinas podcast, as well as Restore the Glory, which is Dr. Bob Schutt's podcast. Both of those episodes are well worth listening to. And his book is very accessible. It has the potential to really help a lot of people. So I want to consider what he's doing through the lens of Thomistic psychology so we can see how it works and why. And also see if there's any place that maybe we could tweak it or identify any potential liabilities in that approach. So this is a diagram from the back of Dr. Crete's book. And Dr. Crete is Catholic and he knows a fair amount about St. Thomas, so he's already got this body-soul composite idea portrayed as I'm showing here. It's very similar to what we've already talked about with an area of overlap between the material and the immaterial. He situates the parts in that overlap along with what he calls the inmost self. So I came across this diagram a few months ago as I was really digging into Father Ripperger's material and trying to understand the big complicated diagram, well enough to be able to present it today. And when I saw this, I looked at it and I considered it and something clicked. And maybe some of you see it before I did, but so let's take this diagram and put it next to Father Ripperger's. Let's draw a circle around the immaterial parts. So you see the circle marked soul on the top diagram. Let's do the same thing down here. That's basically referring to the same thing. This is the territory of the immaterial soul. Now let's do the same thing for the material faculties and call it body. So these two overlap just the same way. It's just kind of turned on one side. And look at the area in the middle. So what's in the overlap? It's all those dual substance faculties, all the things that are in the realm of that project manager, the cogitative power. In fact, I took the opportunity to ask Father Ripperger about this when he and I were at a conference earlier this year. I asked him, so what do you know about IFS? And he said, well, not much. And so I explained it to him. And I said, so where do parts come from? And he said, well, it's a fragmentation at the level of the cogitative power. So for every big, important memory, you can end up with sort of a dedicated junior project manager that's in charge of that particular type of phantasm, if that makes sense. It includes all the memories and all the associated emotions and unconscious mental habits that go along with it. So with the 8-year-old who got jelly on his shirt, one part of his cogitative power is in charge of the phantasm of getting laughed at in the school lunchroom with jelly on his shirt. There's another one that's in charge of sitting on the parents' living room sofa and trying to fight with the brother to get control of the remote, So you've got all these different little junior project managers. Parts would reside, again, in this interface between the body-soul composite, which is the same thing as what Dr. Crete shows in his diagram. But what about the inmost self? What is that? Is that like some original cogitative power, like before any of these big memories happened? Is there such a thing? Is there an original part that remains separate from all the other parts? Or could it be, look over here, so parts there, look over here at these, the intellect and will. These are higher faculties, set apart, reserved to the soul. They're an inner protected part of us that's off limits to every spirit but God, and it's where we most clearly reflect his image and likeness, and it's where we seek union with him. Shouldn't this be our inmost self, where our free will is always free? So if I'm right in understanding this, then Dr. Crete's diagram is spot on, except for this one thing. Move inmost self over here, and it becomes fully Thomistic. So in practice, I have to say, what Dr. Crete is doing, parts work, is great. It is a profound way to basically get work done around difficult memories that have fragmented our cogitative power and caused people to be held hostage by all their immature, not fully conscious reactions to things. But I will say that before I ever dug into it at this level, something in me had a concern about IFS, at least the original non-Catholic version, because in the hands of some therapists, particularly secular ones, the goal seems to be a generally happy internal family that gets along well but remains separate, and sometimes proudly so, rather than achieving true integration, which it always seemed to me would indicate the deepest level of healing. And I believe Dr. Crete would agree with this, having heard him say more or less as much on those podcasts. I think that's one reason why he calls what he does parts work instead of IFS. Now, besides Dr. Crete, the other Catholic IFS therapist that I mentioned, Dr. Peter Malinowski was also on Dr. Bob Schucht's podcast last fall, I think. And during that podcast, there was an interesting discussion about whether there may have been parts before the fall. So whether Adam and Eve were created with parts, or whether Jesus had parts. Not parts of the soul like faculties of the human person, the way we've been talking about, but IFS type parts. And even before I understood this completely, understood that the parts are actually caused by a fragmentation at the level of the cogitative power, the idea of Jesus or Adam and Eve having parts before the fall didn't seem right. because parts arise because of wounds, because of our sin or the sin of someone else that's wounded us. And Father Ripperger confirmed this for me when I spoke to him about it. He said there could not have been parts until Eve considered the apple and she desired it apart from God's will. When she looked on it and she saw that it was good, yes, God created it good, but it wasn't good for her. For her, it was expressly forbidden. So at that moment when she allowed her desires to depart from the will of God, it created a split in her cogitative power, and parts were born. So no, Jesus didn't have parts, because his will never departed from the will of his Father. My Father and I are one, he said. All the way here. Full integration throughout his life. He still had a 6-year-old outlook on the world when he was 6, and he still had a 9-year-old outlook on the world when he was 9, and a 12-year-old when he was 12, etc., just like all of us do. But all of those parts were continually, seamlessly integrated in an undivided will that was united with the will of the Father throughout his life, so they never became parts. His humanity was so completely integrated with his divinity that his cogitative power never split, it never fractured. I hope that makes sense. So, in summary, parts work is a powerful tool, but the goal needs to be full integration, full healing, which involves reconciliation of the soul, the inmost self, with its creator. And that happens most readily when our higher faculties stay in charge, when we order our intellect to the truth, and our free will brings all these separated parts and conflicted desires and wayward emotions back together. This work of integration should happen at every level. So we need to catechize our intellect, we need to train our will, we need to heal and purify our memories and emotions. We need to take custody of our imagination. And this is the work that all of us ideally are engaged in throughout our lives. Along those lines, I just want to briefly mention Dr. Bob Schutz and the John Paul II Healing Center, which I hope most of you are aware of. They were just here in December doing an archdiocese-wide retreat. So their work fits smack into the middle of what I've just been talking about. They help people work through and integrate their painful memories, aided by the Holy Spirit, which is a phenomenally powerful and effective approach to healing, as well as being extremely Thomistic. And it can be used right alongside and in addition to parts work and various forms of CBT and many other therapies as well. EMDR is another tool that can fit right in here. So, what of my hypothesis? Well, we only covered a few forms of modern therapy. There's a lot more we could talk about. But I believe that as far as we've been able to go today, I have shown that this is true, that proven helpful therapies such as CBT, ACT, DBT, parts work, inner healing modalities promoted by the John Paul II Healing Center, all of these appear to reflect and respect Thomistic principles. More problematic, controversial approaches, such as those of humanistic psychology promoted by Carl Rogers, those violate those Thomistic principles, and they have caused harm. So I am very grateful for your time and attention, and I hope that I've been able to explain all of this in a way that makes sense and gives you some insight into how Thomistic principles can be such a helpful guide to navigate modern life and mental health care. And hopefully we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
Okay,
go ahead.
could you say something about the role of conscience, a well-formed conscience in this?
The question is, can I say something about a well-formed conscience? I mean, that's essentially the intellect.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
The same,
Yeah,
same
pretty much. Let's go in the very back.
So you talked about the emotions being in that heart. Here. And then at the very end here, you were speaking about how Jesus didn't have those parts, right?
The fracturing, yeah.
The fracturing, right. So I just have a question. How do we explain when Jesus asked to be relieved from that suffering from his Father? And then secondly, also when he had that emotion to stop the people from selling on his Father's Day.
Right.
That righteous.
Yeah, so how do we make sense of Jesus' emotions? Like, for example, in the garden when he said, not, take this cup from me, yet not my will be done, or not my will but yours be done. So that's the thing. And this helps us to understand, like, what do we make? Sometimes we have such pain. How is it that we can have such pain and still be united in our will? That will is different from the emotion, right? As long as you can still have that pain, you can make use of that pain. That's such a poignant moment in the Passion that we can unite our suffering to God's, because we will all experience times when we have just overwhelming suffering. And yet, I mean, everything in us humanly is rejecting that pain, yet we still are free to choose to say with Jesus, not my will but yours be done, Father. We're still uniting our wills even though we feel terrible.
So can we say that Jesus did have that emotional, as a human?
Oh, absolutely. Jesus had those parts. Jesus had emotions, but he didn't have fragmented. It was all still in line. And that's the thing. Some people mistakenly believe, oh, if I'm healed, I'll never feel bad. That's not true.
Thank you.
Pat, did you?
Well, I'm just really amazed by the focus in the culture on trauma.
Yes.
And the way people are identified by their trauma.
Yeah, that trauma is everywhere. The trauma, people are talking about that. And there is a focus, there's an inordinate focus on that. Yeah.
I'm really hopeful with these. Is there hope for the culture in this realm?
Well, there's always hope.
Right.
I mean, no, there has to be a total shift in understanding. I mean, the thing with trauma, with talking about something as traumatic, is that you are focusing on the emotion, on how it makes you feel, rather than on the fact that God's will always and everywhere is our salvation. And so if he permitted something to happen, it means there is a salvific purpose to it. And as time goes on, as you mature, you start to realize that the most painful things in your life are generally the times during which you can learn the most, you can grow the most. It might be that experience was saving you from something worse, but ultimately, those times of our deepest, darkest emotions are the times when we can most powerfully, deeply unite with our Lord in that. Those that's our cross, that's our passion. And when we can unite, that's an opportunity for us to unite, to achieve union with our Lord in a way that's deeper and more profound than we can ever experience it when things are going well. So I hope that, so if you look at trauma, and that the other thing is, I should say, there's a difference between trauma and violence. So the crucifixion was violent. It wasn't traumatic. Jesus was not left traumatized because he did not fight the suffering. He fully consented to it. He fully stayed in union with his Father's will. So that's the path out of trauma is the crucifixion, basically. So, do we need to stop? Okay.
Yeah, so we have to formally end because it is now 5 past 11:30.
but thank you, Kristen, for this. For me, this has been beautiful. I was only here for the second half, but for me as a monk, this is a beautiful testament that sometimes the answers to the problems of contemporary culture can be found in authors medieval and even ancient. So instead of trying to figure out our own answers or trying to listen to people who haven't read some of the ancient or medieval authors, maybe they have already thought about these questions, and so it's time to recover them. And I thank you just for that, for recovering St. Thomas's psychology for us.